All right. So what is that better? Okay. What do we mean when we say it's more than Safe Sanctuaries? So I told you earlier that one of my jobs is I am the coordinator of training and policy creation for the conference for Safe Spaces. And so Safe Spaces is made up of 3 parts that I want you to make sure you understand, because it's important for you to know that you have access to this information. Okay? So Safe Spaces is the ministry area, and it includes 3 parts. It includes Safe Sanctuary, which includes training and policy creation. Okay? And then boundaries and sexual ethics, and that's sometimes we think that only applies to clergy, but our new policy and also really the discipline of the United Methodist Church says that clergy and sexual ethics policies, or boundaries and sexual ethics policies, apply to all persons in leadership within the church. Okay, so that whether you're lay, clergy, paid, unpaid, if you're in leadership in the church, this sexual ethics policy applies to you as well. Okay, and then the 3rd part of our ministry is the conference response team. And that's a team that I hope that we never have to use. But unfortunately we do. And that team is tasked with not investigating whatever happened, but going into a church or a space where possibly something did occur that might have crossed a safe sanctuary boundary, an ethical boundary, a sexual misconduct situation, a financial misconduct, something there where this response team's role, again, is not investigation, but to come in and provide pastoral care so that the persons that are leading ministry within the church have the ability to continue ministry within the church, and this response team helps them do that by addressing the pain, by addressing the concern, by addressing the difficulties that might be there from the situation that occurred. This response team is activated by a process through your district superintendent and the bishop. It's not something that I call up Lenita Monroe, who's the pastor at Shelbyville First and the chair and the coordinator of this team, and say, Lenita, I need you to go to this church. I have to talk to that church's district superintendent and the bishop and so on, and then they talk with Lenita about the process. Okay? And so I just wanted to make sure you were aware of that, because sometimes what we found, I was a part of a team back in 2010 that looked at all of the ways that we deal with safe sanctuaries, sexual misconduct, investigation, response. And that's when we created Safe Spaces, because what we found was people just didn't know. Some churches didn't know anything about safe sanctuaries. Okay? 2, some folks in churches didn't know that there were clergy sexual ethics policies and boundaries things that could help provide support and training. And then 3, they definitely didn't know what to do in the event of a situation happening and what resources would be available to them. Okay? So we created this Safe Spaces ministry to be that umbrella. My goal, my goal would probably be into 2018 before it would happen. But as I walked through Smyrna First this morning, and I went up the stairway, there was a sign at the top of the stairs. Does anybody remember what that sign said? Anybody see it, maybe? Or was it just me, the Safe Spaces guy? It said, parents, you must check your children out of Sunday school. Okay? Those are things that we talk about in Safe Sanctuaries. And so one of my goals for churches is that I'd like for them, we would like to be able to say and create a nice sign or something, labels or whatever of this logo, and be able to give to a church that meets those criteria, that they're training people, their policy is up to date, it's a priority through the way that they have signage and things like that, and they can put that little label on their door window or something to say, this is a safe space church. And I'll tell you why that's important as we go through this training. Okay? So the other thing I want to make sure you knew about was our website. We went through a website transformation in the past couple of years at the Tennessee Conference. Our website is tnumc.org. tnumc.org. And on our website, and this is a picture, so I'm not able to scroll through it, but on our website, you'll find under either Next Gen Discipleship or Transform Leaders, or just doing a search, you'll find Safe Spaces Ministry. Okay? And what we've done with Safe Spaces Ministries, their page, is make sure that you have the information that you needed to do to have access to, and some tools and things like that. So I'm going to scroll through some of those things so you'll see that. And I know it's difficult to read up here. It already talks, this first part talks about the things I've already told you. Reverend Terry Carty is the chair of the Safe Spaces Ministry. He helped create some of the very first policies that we had for both of these areas when he was back in the early 90s. And then Julie and I are the two staff people in the Tennessee Conference. Julie is our background check specialist, basically. She's not going to do the background check for you, but she's going to tell you how to access the background check system. Because here's something that you may not know about, and hopefully you do, but you might not yet. We have provided every church, every related ministry in the Tennessee Conference, access to a professional, a high-quality background check company. Okay? A lot of times it costs several $1,000s just to get set up. So we covered that cost. We negotiated a one-time access fee with them. And so we have done that through our budget. And so then what you have to do, and Julie can help you do that, is on our website it talks you through the steps that you need to do to be able to set yourself up as a background check access church. Some of you may have already done that, because if you've come to Warmth and Winter or any of those things that we do for children's and youth ministry, we've expected your volunteer leaders to have background checks before they come. So maybe you're paying for another service other than Track 1. That's an added expense that you don't need to do because we've already paid that for you. You'll still have to pay for the background checks that you access or that you request. Okay? The other part of this Track 1 piece is that there's another tool called Smart Track. And Smart Track is the place where when Ben runs a background check on Trish, and then he wants to go back and he's forgotten when did he run that last background check on Trish. It's stored in this Smart Track for Asbury that shows Trish's background check there, and he can go and look at it again. But it also has the date and the recommended recheck date. Okay, so it's a way to manage and organize your volunteers and whether or not people have had background checks or not. Also inside Smart Track is a online training module that you can access, and I think it's $10 to do the training. And so if somebody is like, you've got somebody that they have to have a background check, maybe they're going on a mission trip and you just don't have time to do it, they can go there, take this training and so on, and then pass that background, have the background check done, have the training done, and they're good to go. And that logs it into Smart Track 2. Okay? The thing about Track 1 was that it was developed in partnership with Joy Melton, who is the United Methodist leader and developer of Safe Sanctuaries. And so Track 1 and Joy have worked together since their inception to be doing background checks for churches. Okay? All right, so all else on here. Also on our website, you'll see how do you make a report, and what do you do in the case that there is a problem. Of course, as I'll talk about later, your first report, if it's sexual misconduct, sexual abuse, physical abuse, anything like that causes harm, your first report would be to the police because we're a mandatory reporter state. But there's another process that we also do, that if you're in a local church and something happens in your church, then you're to call your district superintendent and make sure they know what's happening so that they can inform the bishop, so that the bishop knows what's happening, and then the bishop can activate the crisis response team if needed, or the media team if needed, or the conference response team if needed, and so on. Okay? And we're not going to go into that full response plan, like the media response plan. But the key thing here is that we want you to know is that the bishop is the one that decides who the spokesperson is, even for your church. Okay? When something happens in a church, and we'll talk about 2 or 3 examples that have happened in churches in our area, news medias are going to jump on it fast, and they're going to call the first number they find for your church. Your response is always, I'm not able to comment on that, but let me take a message and I'll send your information to the person who can. Okay? And that may be the bishop. It may be the director of communications from our office, Amy Hurd, who knows how to respond appropriately to media requests. Okay? Also on this page, there are a lot of resources. In 2016 or 15, we passed a new sexual misconduct policy, and so that is there. Okay, and as I said, that's not just for clergy; it's for church leaders, both lay and clergy, serving in the church. At annual conference 2016, no 17. Actually, that was 16. This is 17, wasn't it? So this past annual conference, we passed the new Safe Sanctuary policy for the conference. Okay. And that policy is the minimum standard that your church should have for a policy. So if you say to me, Brad, we don't have a Safe Sanctuary policy, my response is, well, take the one that we just passed at annual conference, and you can edit that to say your church's name and start there. Okay? But also, there are other resources. Sometimes I'll get requests from churches and leaders that says, well, what do we do if a person who's on the National Sex Registry comes and lets us know that they're at our church? They're supposed to do that. That's part of their license, or their being registered on the sex registry. They have to disclose that to you if they're in a space where children and youth or women, depending on their case. Well, there's a policy that was created that's up there. It's called When the Abuser is Among Us. Okay? When the Abuser is Among Us. It's a process that talks you through how you set it up. And I've seen it set up well, and I've seen it set up very poorly, because they've tried to adapt or change this policy to fit whatever they wanted. It really is important that once that's identified, that you sit down and have a conversation with that person about why it is that you're going to have shepherds now partner with them to be on campus whenever they are. Okay? You want those shepherds to be the same gender as the person who is the abuser, but they're going to be that person or persons who will be with them when they're on campus. Okay? It's not like they're handcuffed to them and shackled to them or whatever else, but they're just going to be there with them to help. Two things. One, it's for both sides. It protects the church potentially from somebody that might be there for the wrong reasons. But I always want to make sure they understand that it also protects them from accusations. Because when somebody is identified as a sex abuser or on a national registry, and that's fully, that's public information. So anybody in your church could go and search that, right? And somebody finds out that Joe whoever, or Sally whoever, has been on the registry, and they see that person in your church, there's a higher likelihood that when something happens, they're going to be the first ones to be accused. Okay? And so that's what that shepherd is there for, to help protect them as well. Okay? And then, further down on the page, there are other things. So, if you said you didn't have a policy, you have our access to our conference policy, but also there's a starter policy for smaller congregations that you can download. It's a Word document, okay? And we'll talk you through the process of how to create a policy if you don't have one. There's one for medium, there's one for larger, and so on. And then there's also several resources for how you talk with your children and youth about internet safety. And there's some really good resources from the Center for Missing and Exploited Children that you can download and access. And there's videos from it's part of that division is NetSmart, N-E-T-Z Smarts. And it's got great resources. It's got some really cool little videos for children, young children, that talks about internet safety, because as we'll talk about in a minute, you'll see that we need to be talking about it. And then it also has covenants for youth, for tweens, and so on that are. All right, so that's all of the resources that are there, and there are more resources. Had a question just yesterday evening about what do we do, what's the policy that the conference has on active shooters. And we have not adopted an official policy yet, because Your local sheriff's department, your local police department, and Homeland Security have all created tools for us to use. Okay, so we're talking with our chancellor right now about whether the Tennessee Conference actually needs to develop a policy or just provide recommendations to access to those spaces. So if you're uncertain about that, check with your local police department, check with your sheriff. Pretty much all of them will be able to come out and provide training of some kind in that area. Okay? So why? Why do we do it? And we might be able to say, well, why not? We should. I mean, obviously, we've already talked about it, right? Why do we need to think about this? And why is this called, it's more than Safe Sanctuaries? And as we go through, you'll see why. But I just want to show you some of the real statistics right now. Here's some real statistics. And it's shown that research shows that 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 20 boys have been a victim of child abuse, child sexual abuse. Self-report studies show that 20% of adult females and 5 to 10% of adult males recall a child's sexual assault or sexual abuse incident. One thing that I didn't say, and I should have, and I apologize. I do a lot of these trainings, and if there's ever a time, and I don't know your story, okay? So if I say something, or if there's something on the slide that may have reminded you of a situation in your life, or you're feeling that you need to leave, just go ahead and step out, all right? But if you need somebody to step out with you, just let us know. Raise your hand. Ask somebody to go out with you, okay? I should have said that from the start. During a 1-year period in the U.S., 16% of youth ages 14 to 17 had been sexually victimized. 16%, 14 to 17-year-olds. Over the course of their lifetime, 28% of U.S. youth ages 14 to 17 had been sexually victimized. Children are the most vulnerable to child sexual abuse between the ages of 7 and 13. So those are some real statistics, right? But I also want you to think about the reality. I typed in youth ministry mugshots, and this popped up. Now, I don't know every one of these people's story, and I don't know if every one of them are actually youth ministers or not, but I know that 2 of them are. And I know one of their stories very clearly. Okay? And we're going to talk about that story in a little bit. But the reality is, I wonder how many of these folks have never been trained, if they all are youth ministers, have they never been trained in some kind of risk management? Had they never been trained in Safe Sanctuaries? Had they never been trained in boundaries? Or what was it that found them there? Were they just prone to be predators? We don't know. But I do know one of their stories that I'll talk about in just a little bit. But here's something that Stephanie alluded to earlier about smaller churches and safe sanctuaries and so on. That's real fact. This quote came from a child sex offender. And this person said that I consider church people easy to fool. They have a trust that comes from being Christians, and they tend to be better folks all around and seem to want to believe in the good that exists in people. And so this is an actual quote from a child sex offender. And so what we have to do whenever we're talking about keeping ministry safe, it doesn't matter what size church that you attend, or that you're representing here. The reality is, they're going. If they want to come to your church, they're coming because they think they can come and not be found out. But we want to do everything we can to make sure that we're just not opening the doors for them to come in and be there without us knowing who is there. Okay? All right? And that doesn't mean that you're going to spend the rest of the day going through the National Sex Registry, putting in your zip code and so on and doing all that. You can do that if you want to. In fact, I do it sometimes in my neighborhood. Just as I see houses sell, I want to know who's moving into my block because I've got a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old living in my house. Right? Okay? But there's a deeper why that I want to make sure we understand. And I was a public school educator and was trained in that, and so I learned about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so, at our core, just above the need for food and water and shelter is a need for safety. A need for safety. We want to be safe. We want to know that the ministries that or the things that we're doing, is it safe for us? And then me as a parent, it never became more clear for me as a parent until my newborn daughter and I attended Epworth for the first time. And that would have been after she was old enough to not get germs from anyone because of my pediatric wife, who's a pediatrician. So that was like 9 or 10 weeks before we could take her out of the house anywhere. But I don't think that I consciously said when we got out of the car, we're going to just do a scan to make sure this place is safe or not. We're going to look for this, look for that, look for that. But now as I've done all this training and as I've done all this research and so on, and I start to reflect on those first times that I came into that space with Mary in my arms or in the car seat, I was doing this stuff. And David Kinnaman, who's the president of the Barna Group, he says that our research consistently shows that how churches treat children is one of the keys to drawing and retaining new families. Sadly, churches expose themselves to all kinds of potential problems by failing to screen the people who will have contact with and responsibility for the children of strangers during church events. Because there's a level of trust that newcomers as well as longtime members place in the capacity of a church to provide comprehensive care for their children. Okay? So there's this level of trust. And so as my wife and I were sitting there, and this wonderful saint of the church who's gone on, Evelyn Vaden, sat down next to us, and she started, holding Mary's hand and talking to her and so on. We felt like there was and she started pointing out, well, we follow Safe Sanctuaries here. We have a nursery in there, but you're welcome to keep your baby with you in the sanctuary. Okay? We don't care if she cries. If you need to go out, and if you need to go out and find some place to feed her or whatever, I'll show you where to go. And so Evelyn knew how to make us feel safe in that space. Okay? She knew not to push us out of the sanctuary into a space that we hadn't felt comfortable with until we had the ability to explore it ourselves. Because that day, we snuck in the back of the sanctuary, and it was still at the old church there on Arno Road, and we sat in the very back pew. Because we just wanted to slide in and see what it was like, right? But she saw that. And whether it was intentional on her part or unintentional, that became a key part of our faith journey at Epworth United Methodist Church. Because she took the time to help us feel safe with our new child. So as we think about safe spaces, it's a combination of all of these things. We don't want to ever have to get to the place where we have to use this conference response team. Okay? But we want to be proactive. Yesterday at the Global Leadership Summit, they talked about, as leaders, we have to be on the offense, not always on the defense. And in terms of safe sanctuaries and safe spaces, being on the offense is being proactive, not reactive. Okay? So having these policies in place, doing the due diligence that we're going to talk about in a minute, about background checking, screening, training, and looking at whether you have windows and doors and all these kind of things we're going to talk about. That's being proactive. That's being on the offense side. Because if a situation happens, you're going to be on the defense. Okay? You're going to be in reaction mode, and you don't want to be there. So I'm not as concerned in this process always about what we're doing, about whether we understand why we're doing it. Okay? We have to understand why we're doing it. And I can stand up here and tell you, like I have so far, why we should, but the reality is, my knowledge is limited to what's in my brain right now. Okay? And so what I want you to do at your tables is I want you to spend a moment to talk to some partners there at your table and talk about why you think we need to have a balance. We need to have both safe sanctuaries. So sort of that law, how we operate, what are some guidelines that we need to have? And then how do we have the boundaries and sexual ethics part about how we live in relationship with each other? Okay? And that's what that is. Sexual ethics and boundaries is about relationship. Safe sanctuaries is too, but it's more about the laws and the practices that we have to put in place to keep us safe as we live in relationship. So talk with your table mates there for I'll give you about 80 seconds to get some really great ideas. Go ahead. Let's just hear a few ideas. What did you talk about? Why is it important to balance or to think about safe sanctuaries and boundaries? Thank you, Scott. What did y'all talk about? Don't be shy, or I may call out your name. Raise your hand. All answers are right, unless they're not shared. Adam.
I think it's balancing the safety, but also the relationship with each other. We have to have that safe area so kids can feel comfortable with our dogs, but also know they can have enough love there to share with each other.
Right. Okay. And the balance of safe, where they feel safe, where they're there, but also that they know that that the people that are there, there's love there. Okay, Izzy?
A lot of abuse happens within families. We've done this training, we've done too many times. But like a lot of it happens within family members. And so sometimes church either has a lot of family members there that have been perpetrators of it and the system protects them, or like the culture protects them, or they're coming from homes that may have had that abuse. And so church is the only safe place for them. So establishing those boundaries, knowing that such a high number of people, a lot of people don't ever say that they've been abused, so the numbers are much higher than we see. And so knowing that that reality is what we're dealing with, and knowing that like children need to know what their boundaries are so that they can interact with adults properly, not just in the church but outside the church, because outside the church you're going to take more advantage of them. So I mean, it's just a very serious thing of like balancing all of that.
Very true, very true. Anybody over here? We're calling somebody. We're calling Angie Trimmer. What did your group talk about?
Well, we work in a little bit of a vulnerable situation.
That's why I asked you to say that.
We have a lot of people who have felony convictions. They're coming out of an incarcerated setting. We deal with addictions in general, and includes sex addiction. So this is something we were just talking about as a team. You know, we have our team background check, but if we get a large number of kids, we might have to pull another one here and there. So we probably need several layers deep of volunteers that we might pull on, and maybe think through some of the times where the parents are supposed to be watching the children, because we have a lot of shared meals and cookouts and retreats and functions where there's just a whole bunch of people of all ages in the space. So we might want to rethink how we keep kids safe when they're supposed to be under their parents' watch, but they're on church property.
Very good. Very good. Yes?
I guess I better speak up because the community that I'm in, well, the church that I'm in, first of all, is connected to an organization which is day shelter for the homeless. And we have a chart that's so infested with the red dots that it affects our church as to how we have to be proactive with locking up the doors. And you just can't just come in and you get ready into the church. So basically, some of the actions that we do as far as the children that go to the restroom, they just don't go to the restroom. You know, we have things in place like that.
Yeah, so he's at Nancy Webb Kelly, which if you've ever served at Community Care Fellowship in Nashville, over off of Shelby Avenue in that area, that's where he is. Tell me your name again, I'm sorry.
John.
John, my new BFF.
That's
Yes.
right.
So John, I could probably go to Nancy Webb Kelly with a big sticker right now and just put it on the door, because I've been there. And it's and one day I made the mistake. I was in there with Project Transformation because I serve on the board of directors for them, and I was supposed to be doing a training with their team. I walked in, realized I left something in my car, and I got locked out of the building. I didn't know how to get back in because they weren't going to just let me back in, because they were like, "What are you doing back?" It's like, "You're supposed to be already here." And so, but true, very true. And so contextually, their level may look different than your level, okay?
And we also, another thing is that most men in the church, we are automatically secure. If something sounds or smells or don't taste quite right, you see the action of us. It's just a response.
Yeah.
And we go into action. And we don't have to ask anybody, it's just, a normal thing. I'm sure it's like that in any church. So, that's what we know to do. We call it.
Yes. Tell me your name again, Becky.
It occurs to me in a very rural environment where we are, a very small county, that there is no framework. We have no framework. I think I just what gives you framework is experience, and we shouldn't have to wait for experience to put the framework into place.
Right, and we want to help with you. We want to help you put the framework in place if you don't have that framework, or if you have it and you're uncertain about it. Because here's the deal. At the heart of the why, this is what I want to make sure you understand. It's the heart and souls of the people who serve in the ministries, or who are being served in the ministries that we're serving in. So it's in your setting, Angie, it is those folks that have been incarcerated or are sex addicted or drug addicted, but it's also people who are there that are not, right? In your setting, it's people who live in the housing communities that are around you, or the homeless folks that are coming to Community Care Fellowship, but it's also the people who attend your church. Okay? And for you out there in that New Union, in a rural setting, it's for people who have never maybe even heard about why they need to do it, because they know everybody and they've known everybody their whole lives.
Printed.
And newspaper printed, right.
You get to see who got arrested.
Exactly right. All right?
10 or 12 a week in a county of 5,000.
Right. And so we have to be aware of it. And the reality is, there may be churches here or that we know of who have experienced some kind of misconduct inside the church. I know one of the very first trainings that I did with a church, as before we went in, the pastor and the youth minister pulled me aside and said, "You're not going to believe this, but we want you to address this when you get in there." And it was this was right after fall break or somewhere in that time frame, and they said they found out during fall break that one of the youth volunteers had been smoking marijuana with the kids. You know? And they want to make sure that I address that. Because the reality is, I didn't talk about sex, I didn't talk about drug abuse or any of those kind of things in those first sets of statistics. But that is as much of a violation of Safe Sanctuaries as well, right? And so I did. And I think the person, the volunteer, was in the room, and I said, you know, it's not a good idea, nor is it violates your policy, and if it's not in your policy, you need to put it in there. That smoking marijuana with kids on a mission trip is not okay. Okay? So, and I didn't point out, and I don't even think I knew who the person was in the room. But we have to think beyond more than sexual abuse. Okay? More than misconduct in that way too. So it's the heart and souls of the people we serve. It's also our hearts. We who are serving in ministry. Our hearts and souls matter too. And that's the thing that we have to think about, is like, especially as church leaders, and that's one of the things that I love to convey to churches who say we have so much problem getting volunteers, that I like to convey to the larger church, you are putting all of the weight of responsibility on this one person. Not only are you putting the responsibility of them to minister to your child, but also the whole weight of the safety of your child on this one person. Is that safe, and is that fair? Or is that equitable to them? No, it's not. And it's not, like my daughter has been at the fair, and she went with one of her friends. And I said, text me when you get to the fair, text me when you get back to your house. She went to the fair, realized it didn't open till 6. She went back to her house. So she texted me that she got to the fair, then she texted me she was leaving from the fair. I want to know where my kids are, right? And it's not that I don't like her friend or her friend's parents, but I want to know where my kids are, okay? And so I want to be responsible for them. Because also, our job, our main calling to build discipleship is to create sacred space. And it can't be a sacred space if it's not a safe space. But a sacred space can happen anywhere. It can happen on a bus. It can happen at a fire pit. It can happen at a pond. It can happen in a classroom. Okay? If those folks, and if you create a space that's focused on, and I'm not talking about not taking risks, like going on a whitewater rafting trip, and I should have put a picture of our group that we just went on with our leadership team a few weeks ago, because we had this one crew of students and adults. Chris Durham, who's the associate pastor at Murfreesboro First, was in the boat, and one of our younger girls was sitting out in the front of the boat, and they hit this rapid, and Trinity flew up in the air. Like in the picture, her feet and her bottom is off the boat, like in the air. and all you see is Christlin's hand holding onto the back of her life jacket, like keeping her from flying out of the boat. Okay? Now, Mom and Dad, when they saw that, they were like, "Oh my gosh, she nearly got out." And Trinity said, "Mom, it was fine. Chrislin had me. I was fine." Trinity had a blast. And so there was a risk there. I probably wouldn't have wanted to take that risk necessarily.
You need to explain to everyone that Chrislin's this big.
Chrislin is not much bigger than Trinity either. So, but the reality was, it was an experience that Trinity and Chrislin and the rest of the people on that boat and the rest of us are going to remember forever. And it's also that same symbol. It's like, we're there. We're going to keep everybody safe, you know. We had a young girl, Leslie Hernandez, fell out of the boat. And on the way out, James Touchton tried to catch her and keep her from falling out, and he couldn't, and so he fell in with her to try to help her. Okay? The thing about it was her sister, before she went on the trip, told her she couldn't go because she had a dream that she was going to die falling out of a whitewater raft. And so all that Leslie could think about whenever she fell out of that raft was Elizabeth's dream. So when she got back in, she was hyperventilating because she thought for sure she had died, but she didn't. Okay? And then this other part, and there's a lot of other reasons why, but you are responsible. You are responsible. I am responsible. All of us are responsible. Even the people who say they never are going to serve in a ministry, just like John said, when something's out of the ordinary, they snap into action. We need to have a setting like that, you know? I was working with a church who was giving me every reason why they couldn't lock their exterior doors at a training. They said, "We just don't understand, you know, they're push-out bars or so on. If we lock that, then they can't get into this and so on." And so somebody finally said, this older gentleman, he just raised his hand, he was so polite. He said, "I am tired of you all complaining about what we can't do." He said, "Here's what we're going to do." He said, "I'm going to put together a team of about 4 or 5 of us, and we're going to stand out in the parking lot, and we're going to greet people, and we're going to have somebody at that door to let them in when it's locked, and we're just going to make sure that we see what's going on, and we're not going to promote ourselves as security with badges and stuff like that. We're going to be parking lot hospitality, and we're going to know who comes in and out of the building, and we're going to be there to let the door open and lock whenever it needs to be locked." I didn't have to solve that problem. He got tired of hearing them telling us what they couldn't do. Okay? So we have to think about it. Because the balance that has to happen is that safe sanctuaries and healthy boundaries combined together allow us to live and serve in healthy relationships that connect and reveal God's love for all of us. Safe sanctuaries and healthy boundaries combined allow us to reveal God's love to everyone. Okay? It gives that mom, like Mandy, who has a newborn baby, the security that if she sends her children to the nursery, that there's things in place that she doesn't have to worry about them while they're there because it's being taken care of. Okay? It's for that single mom or that single dad that says, "I can't go to church because I don't know what's going to happen to my kids while I'm there." Okay? Or that grandparent who's raising their grandchildren. Whatever the situation is. You know, it's about helping them have a space where they can be safe, and so then that can become a sacred space for them, and so they can encounter God as well. Okay? And here's the other reality. One of my friends shared this on Facebook a couple years ago, and so these statistics are a little bit older. But he said that based on research he did, there are about 74 million, just under 74 million children and youth under 18 in this 2014 census. And there are 108,000 paid part-time or full-time children, youth worker type people. And if it was the responsibility of only the per-paid people to minister to or care for each one of those 73 million plus kids, then that means that each of those people would have to take care of 680. 680. That's unrealistic. And if we're going to claim everyone for the kingdom of God, then we have to think that way, right? Okay? So, here's what I need. I need, some of you have probably seen me do this before, so if you've seen me, you have to back up. But if you haven't, if you've never been in one of my trainings, I need 2 people to come up front, and then a 3rd person to come and assist me. So 2 people, one person that thinks they're full of air, that's great, and another person that's just willing to help them out by holding on to a bag. And then I need somebody to hold on to my bag because you know I'm full of hot air. So, all right? So come on, jump up.
Go Chris! Go Jim! Come on, Bob Brown!
Wow, you didn't pull that, Bob. Now, do you guys think you have a lot of hot air? Or do you think Bob will need to help me?
Okay.
Does Bob have a lot of hot air, or do one of you have? Okay, well, all right. Okay, so Chris, you hold Bob's. And Jennifer, you come over and hold mine. All right? Okay.
Okay.
Wait, are they the same length? I just want to make sure I don't cheat you from the start. And then if they're not, I'll take it out.
Oh, okay.
Okay, thank you. All right. So, Jennifer, you stand over there. So what we're going to do is, have you ever done anything like this? You don't have science or anything?
Not as far as
Don't screw it up.
No, I have no idea.
Don't screw it up.
Okay.
Don't screw it up. So what we're going to do is we're going to race to see who can blow this bag up the fastest without passing out. Do you know what you're doing?
No, I'm just going to blow it.
Blow up the bag. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Back on up.
All right.
Chris, back on up. Okay?
Okay.
All right. All right, ready?
Okay.
Back, ready? One, back on up, back on up. 1, 2, 3.
Every single year.
Did you blow up the bag? Did you blow up the bag?
Awesome.
Okay, let's do it again.
Okay. Okay.
Maybe your bag has a hole in it. Here, wait.
Come on, Bob, you got this.
Ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
1, 2, 3.
What?
No.
All right.
Bob, you're way
No.
more.
All right. So, all right. So, go ahead and lay the bag down. I don't want you to damage it any more than you already have. All right. So, what did we do differently? Go ahead and sit down. Hey, let's give Bob and Jennifer. So what did I do differently than what Bob did? Did anybody watch Bob and watch me?
Yeah.
Dee, what did you see?
That's why you blow into the bag through distance. He had it up trying to blow into it.
All right. So I had it away from my body. Bob had it up close because I told Bob to blow it up. You know, and so what we tend to do when we're told to blow up something, or when we're told to blow up a balloon, or we're told to do a job, and so on, and we're told to focus in on a task, we tend to think that the best way to do it is get up right close to it as best we can and get all of our effort right into it. And so if I'd have told Bob to just keep blowing, Bob would have blown and blown and blown, and he probably would have passed out. He would have to perform CPR. That would have been weird. That's all right. He saved his life, right? But instead, the reality is, just like blowing up that bag, we can't do ministry by ourselves. And so what I did was instead, I stepped back from the bag. Okay? So that as I just performed, I just blew a steady pace. I invited the air that was in the room, and all of you were all breathing out with me, to go into my bag. Okay? If you've been to Chicago or downtown Nashville and you felt the rush of wind through the middle of buildings, that's what we're talking about, the Bernoulli's effect of just blowing steady, slow and steady wins the race, right? So I just blow. Okay, and close it off. When I was younger, I could blow it up even better than that. But we do that in ministry too, and we kill ourselves trying to do it all by ourselves. And we weren't set up that way to be in ministry by ourselves. Jesus didn't do ministry by himself. Okay? God created the world, but rested, and then invited us to do ministry and things in the world too and create, right? And so we all have to be a part of keeping ministry safe, whether that's being in ministry with somebody, and serving kids in ministry, children, and youth, and families, or blowing up a bag, okay? Because you're going to kill yourself, or you're going to wear yourself out trying to do it by yourself, okay? This is powerful numbers. Stephanie shared earlier that one full-time person to 50, or one full-time person to 75. We tend to think that one person, if we get one person, that's all we need. But one person is not going to be able to keep your church safe. Okay? One person is not going to be able to do everything that needs to be happening, to be able to jump up if you suspect something is going on weird, and get to the doors, and so on. All right? So here's what I want you to do. Chandra, back there on that table in front of you, turn around. There's a stack of papers, I think. Is there?
Yes.
Okay, pass those out for me. Chandra's going to give you, and maybe Julie, can you help that other side? Chandra's going to give you a survey that I want you to take. And don't sit there and think a long time about your questions and about the answer. Read the question. You're going to check yes, no, sometimes, I think, is other choices. And don't, like I said, don't spend a lot of time on it. When you get it, you can start. All right, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. What I want you to think about is how do we move our no's to sometimes and our sometimes to yeses? Because when you're trying to change the course of a ministry, or even if you're driving a boat or a car or whatever, you don't just take a hard right turn or a hard left turn and start doing something you've never done before. So how do you move from your no's to sometimes and your sometimes to yeses as you try to help start increasing the ability to keep ministry safe? Okay? And so that's one of the things I want you to think about. These are just questions to think about. It's a very broad and pretty complete list that we want to move towards. If I were to answer this about the church that I serve, that I attend, I probably would not be able to. I know I wouldn't be able to answer yes or sometimes on many of them. Okay, and so that's our goal. Here's what we'll do. Maybe if I remember at some point, maybe at the end, I'll have to write myself a note. But I'll ask you to think about this again and see if you've moved any no's to sometimes and sometimes the yeses. Okay? Any questions that you have about the things that you saw on this survey? Because we're going to talk about many of these things, probably all of these things, here in just a little bit after we move through some other stuff. What we're going to ask you to do, I'm going to give you a set amount of time, and I want you to, on the Post-it note, on each Post-it note, I want you to write down one thing as you think about your church or about ministry that concerns you in terms of safe sanctuaries or boundaries, okay? So what are some risky situations or concerns that come to mind about the setting that you're in? And I'm going to give you 90 seconds to write as many of those as you can. One per Post-it note. Ready? Go. And as you're writing, be aware that you could knock that tower down. So, what? 90 seconds to write as many ideas that concern you as you can on separate Post-it notes. All right, so put your pens down. So here's what I want you to do now. I want you to talk about the risks amongst your group. And if any of you have the same risks, just stick them on the same note, like together, so that they're together. And then, after you do that, so go ahead and do that right now. Let's clump them together, any of them that are the same and so on. Let's make sure we get them together. All right. Everybody look. Listen. Here's what we're going to do now. Here's what we're going to do now. Everybody hear me? Now we're going to take a look at our wrists that we've identified as a table group together, and we clumped them together. Okay? And we're going to try to just do an assessment of, is this a small risk, a medium risk, or a large risk? Okay? Small, medium, or large? Okay? Small, medium, or large? Do that. If you want to, you can write it on the document. Okay? You might have a lot of larges, or you might have a lot of smalls. All right, so here we go. Listen up. Focus back into me. Here's what I want to do. Here's what I want you to do. I'm going to point to a group, and I'm going to ask you either for a small, medium, or large, and I'm not going to ask everybody, but I'm going to take a few, and we can talk about it, and I'll give you some processing as to why I think it's a risk or not a risk, or a small, medium, or large risk. Okay, so let's go with our new union folks. Give me a large risk that you identified. Everybody listen.
Lack of policy and procedures.
Lack of policy and procedures. Large risk. You know why? Because we don't know what we're supposed to do, when we're supposed to do it. And here's the thing. Policies and procedures are so important because they do this. This is the one thing that I want you to hear me about policies and procedures. If you have a policy and procedure and you live it out and you use it as the way you make decisions, then it takes the relationships out of the process. So Chandra and I are friends, and I see Chandra doing something that's highly against Safe Sanctuaries, but because I have this policies and procedures, I can say to Chandra, it's like, Chandra, I know we're friends, but you've got to stop leaving those kids unattended where there's nobody else with them, or with just your one volunteer. Okay, I can say that. But a lot of times the way we do Safe Sanctuaries or other things is, Chandra's my friend. I don't want to hurt her feelings. Okay. Policies and procedures acted out, lived out, take relationships out of it. Let's go to a medium, Summer.
Locking the building that extracurricular groups are in church, or using your church.
Locking it? Yeah. So locking those doors down. Locking those places they don't need to be in. Okay? What it does is it keeps, what I've heard a lot of times, like in our church for a while, and we've got a better relationship now, the Boy Scouts were often accused of busting tables or different things like that because even though they are supposed to be the most secure and the most supervised, they're kids, And so if they have the opportunity to run off and they see something that looks cool and they want to jump on it, they're going to jump on it, and that's what they did. We could have solved that problem by having those doors locked because they didn't need to be in those rooms in the first place. Okay? We could have solved the problem of them taking all of our music director's pencils or pens by just locking the music director's door, right? Okay? So I know. It wasn't just the Boy Scouts at that time. I think it was somebody else. I think it was a music group or something. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. Choir. No. All right? So yes, locking doors is important. Matt wants a small one that y'all threw out. Do you have any small ones?
Youth to adult ratio?
Youth to adult ratio. Small one, you got people there, right? But it's really important. 2 reasons, and Stephanie hit on one of them earlier. Faith development shows that each of us need multiple faith partners around us. Okay? That's important. That's adult to youth ratio. On trips, okay? You're driving. You have one person in the car, one adult in the car. That one adult is tired. That one adult, for some reason, is sick. What's going to happen in that situation? Okay? Okay? One adult is only one in the classroom teaching. Okay? That's not safe either. So you've got to have multiple people in the space. 1 to 5 is what Stephanie said. So that doesn't mean that, I've only got 5 kids, that's just me, I can hang out by myself. No, if you have 1 to 5, you still want another. Okay? Because let me tell you something. I don't connect, as great as I am as a person, I don't like every kid in my youth group, okay? And I'm not going to connect with them as well as somebody else in my church could. So just for the sake of that kid's spirituality, I might want to invite somebody else in there that might better connect with him or her in the first place, okay? Because Jesus loves them. Most of the time, I'm just trying to like them. And so, and not punch them. So, go into wrestling coaching mode, all right? Okay, one more from over here, Trevor. Medium. Inadequate transportation. You cannot load kids into cars anymore without having seat belts for them. I'm sorry. You got to seat belt them. You can't throw kids in the trunk of an SUV and say, well, we're going, let's travel down to Decatur, Alabama to the water park or whatever. Okay? I've seen it done. Okay? Have adequate transportation. I don't even like to have my oldest youth who are able to drive, and even if they're A-plus drivers with Allstate and they've got their parents a lot of money back, I don't like kids to drive. Okay? I don't like kids to drive. My ultimate thing is that if I can take one vehicle, one big vehicle, great, but I'm always going to take a second. Okay? So like when we went to the whitewater rafting trip, Julie would say, because she rode back with them, it was because we didn't want to ride in the van full of kids, or the bus full of kids screaming the whole way, probably. But from a safety standpoint, I believe you need to have at least 2 vehicles when you're traveling. Okay? Because I've seen situations where the first vehicle breaks down, and then what do? You're stranded. You have somebody that's sick or injured at the event that you're at, and you either take the entire group, or you have enough adults there, and you're able to take those other kids back with appropriate ratios to the hospital or to whatever. So you have multiple vehicles, and they all have seatbelts. Okay? And like I said, sometimes it's great to not be in a van or a bus full of kids doing karaoke to music that you can't stand. So here is what you're going to do. Now's the challenge. Some rules. You have a Jenga tower in front of you. For each of the small risks that you have on your table, you cannot take it off the top, the first one that you take. It has to be somewhere in the middle, bottom, somewhere else. But for each of the smalls, you're going to take one block out and just set it aside. For each of the mediums, you're going to take 2 blocks out and just set it aside. For each of the larges, you're going to take 3 blocks out and set it aside. So let's go ahead and start doing that. And each of you have to do it. Each of you have to take a turn taking blocks or 2 or 3 blocks out. All right, set it aside. Go ahead. So, as we identify these risks, and as I ask you to rate them, the reality of rating risk is what, Tommy Van or Matt Sands? Speak loud.
We thought that really all of them are big risks because it depends on the situation. In each one, you could have a more volatile situation with small risk and it become huge. So
Yeah.
really, there's no distinction between small, medium, large. Any risk is a risk.
Any risk that's not addressed is a risk, because what happens is when there's a risk and you overlook it, the next risk or the next situation doesn't go away. It just sits there until something happens, right? And so just like right now, their tower is standing over here. I think theirs in the back is standing. But the next risk, any kind of risk that comes along could wipe it out. And we have to think that way in terms of us and what we do in ministry. And I'm not talking about the church right now. I'm talking about people's lives. I'm talking about the individual who is trying to decide if this is a place that they can come and be in ministry like my wife and I were with a newborn back several years ago. I'm talking about that little kid that has just come from home where his mom and dad or somebody, they've been fighting all the time, and they see that and they're trying to find, is this a safe space for me? Or do they treat me, or do they treat each other like what I see when I'm not at church? Each risk is important. Each risk has to be addressed. And the reality is each one of these risks have the potential to stop ministry from happening. Okay? They each have the ability to stop ministry from happening. So we can't overlook it. And here's what I loved about what John said. And John, I'm going to keep going back to you because you do have a very unique environment. But what I think you guys have understood. I'm sorry. Is that?
No, come on.
Is that you guys have understood? You understand the setting that you're in at Nancy Webb Kelly, right?
Yes.
And you have conversations about the unique setting that you're in at Nancy Webb Kelly. Because not only are you attached to a center that does great ministry with those experiencing homelessness, but you're also in the middle of a housing neighborhood, housing project, right? And a school on one side of you. And so you have constant high traffic of people wanting to come and go. Okay?
That's right.
So they have to think about those things. But New Union also has to think about those things. Because if they decide we can just leave our doors open all the time, okay? And there are children or youth there, and they're engaged in ministry in one part of the building, but yet the rest of the building is open, and it's just open to anybody to come in, and they're not going to know it. That's also an unsafe setting. But they're out in a rural space where everybody's friends with everybody, right? Okay? Or Savannah First in a downtown setting, or Monroe First in a downtown setting. Thinking about that, you each have risks that you have to think about. And those risks some are the same regardless of where you are, but some of them are contextual to the space and the physical plant that you're in, okay? So you have to think about those things. You have to think about, my wife is, as I said, is Deputy Medical Director of Health, and one of her things that she talks about and helps, and she and I have had conversations about since she's got this job, is how do we keep playgrounds safe, okay? Because we want to have playgrounds in our churches, but how do we keep playgrounds safe? Are they open to everyone? Are there no restrictions? Are there no guidelines about how we use them and so on? Or do we say, hey, this is what we want to have happen here so that there is some safety there? Because that's a major place that somebody can get hurt if they're not supervised, okay? Now, John and Sean are just proud of the fact that their tower is still standing. Okay? And they're taking pictures of it and probably going to post it on Instagram and Facebook and whatever else. But we're going to move on beyond that now.
All right, fine.
Can you focus on the next thing? Okay. We've already talked about that importance of policy. We talked about policy and procedure. Policy is the framework of why we do what we do. Okay? Policy is the framework of why we're doing what we're doing. Why are we keeping ministry safe? If all you have is the framework, the policy, then you don't have a complete safe sanctuary policy and procedure because you're missing the procedures. The procedures are the steps, the processes, the things that you're going to do to ensure that ministry is safe and the practices that you're going to do. Okay? So you have to have both. The why and the steps and the how and what you're going to do. Okay? And so we break it down into 3 categories, basically, to think about how we think about procedures. Faces, activities, and spaces. Faces, activity, and spaces. And so as we talk about faces, screen and interview everyone, and all employees and volunteers. And what we mean by screening is that background check that we talked about that Julie can help you perform through Track 1 or another background check system. We'll help you with Track 1. We can refer you to others. We hope you use Track 1. Interviewing everyone means that if you're hiring somebody, there's an interview process you want to go through. But also with those volunteers, you want to sit down and have a conversation with them and ask them questions like, why do you want to serve? What do you like to do? Where do you like to serve? Those kind of things. Get to know them. Find out what their gifts are. Maybe they say they want to serve in ministry with children, and then you find out that they just absolutely hate children. You don't want to put them there. They won't be happy, and neither will your kids. Okay? Other things about faces is check references, especially if you're hiring people, and especially those that are difficult to get background checks if they're younger than what National Records would release, under 20. Check references. It's easy. Just call up to people who know them, who they've worked for, who have they been in school with, like teachers, principals, people who you can get references from. Also use the 5-year older rule. Okay? Now I'm going to share a little bit of a different rule with you in a minute, but the 5-year older rule says that the person serving in ministry in the lead role should be 5 years older than the people that they're leading. Now that does not mean in my mind that a 13-year-old would lead ministry with an 8-year-old. Okay? That means that they could possibly help volunteer in there, but they're not the lead person. Okay? And I know a lot of churches, especially in smaller congregations and some medium and larger opportunities, they let kids serve so that they're learning how to serve in ministry. That's great. They should never be the lead person. Okay? What does that mean about 20-year-olds in youth ministry? They're not 5 years older. So, like CYMT is a program in Nashville that trains youth ministers in Nashville, Memphis, Texas, and so on. When I do their training, I talk to them about making sure that if there's somebody that's not going to be 5 years older, so 23 usually, or older, serving in that ministry, that they have to have other adults paired with them that meet that role. That 23-year-old, because they're being trained, or 22-year-old, because they're being trained as the lead youth person, can do some of those lead roles, but they're always going to be paired with an older adult. Okay? That meets that requirement. The exception that we utilize is at Cedar Crest sometimes, and in junior high ministry, we have utilized a 4-year-old rule. Okay? So if they're 4 years older, they can serve there. And so 18-year-olds might serve in middle school. Okay? But they're not a lead person either. So you have different tiers of people that are serving. That's whoever the lead person is, whoever the volunteer or the backup person is. Lead persons should always meet the full requirements. Lead persons should always be background checked, reference checked, and so on. The volunteers should be reference checked at least, background checked hopefully. Okay? So that you have different levels of classification. And you should always have 2 adults. Always. Okay? Driving a car with a group of kids, 2 adults. Okay? Texting, 2 adults. That's why I use GroupMe for most of my conversations with our youth leadership team. Okay? There's about 7 adults on there. Okay? Going to a coffee shop. What do you say? Well, I've got to counsel this kid, and I know that I can't go with anyone. Then go to a McDonald's or a Starbucks or to an ice cream shop, a frozen yogurt shop in McMinnville, right? Or a biscuit shop in McMinnville, at Adams. Okay? Someplace out there where there are other people moving around that you're not isolated by yourself. Okay? If it comes down to where you have to do that, and you're at the church building, then you need to be in a space where you have the door open, the window open, you let the secretary or the pastor or somebody else know that you're going to be in this space and you want them to stay nearby where they can see. Okay? Again, that's to protect you, that's to protect the person that you're working with. Then activities. These are the things that we're doing. Like, are we going on, are we doing just regular youth ministry, day-to-day youth ministry? So we think about adult-to-child adult-to-child ratios, adult-to-youth ratios. We recommend that the adult-to-youth ratio is 1 to 8, or 2 to 16, or 2 to 8 if you only have 8, okay? Or 1 to 6, or 2 to 12, okay? Children are a lot more active and moving around quite a bit more than lazy teenagers. So you want to have the ratio of your students, of your child to youth a little bit lower. You also want to lower that child or youth adult ratio when you're going on a mission trip, warmth and winter, summer sizzler, please, those kind of things off-site. Yeah, is married couples count as 1 adult. We want you to have a third person not related in that space. Okay? But we also want you to make sure that your genders match your group. So if you've got a group of all girls and all you have are female volunteers, you're good. All guys, male volunteers, you're good. But if you've got male and female, even just one or the other, make it every effort to have a male and a female chaperone at least on that team. And if they're related or married to each other, then a third. medical release registration forms. We advise you to have that. It's an easy process, and people do it. I have to do it for everything else. They have to fill it out for school. They have to fill it out when they go to the doctor. They have to fill it out for whatever. So have a form that they fill out at the beginning of the school year. Whenever they advance a grade or whatever, know that you need to create a new form. And so for us, the form that we use, and you're able to adapt it, our next gen medical release form. If it's not in there, Julie will drop it into the Google Drive. But we say it is good from August 1st to July 31st. Okay? And what we do is if you're coming to the first event of the fall for youth ministry is hands and feet. And so we ask you to bring a new form that when you check in at registration, you show us that you have the forms. You give us a group form that shows everybody that's there and so on. Julie or one of our other registration people keep that form. You keep your health and registration forms. We don't take those. Okay? If Warmth and Winter is your first event, you bring a form there, check it in there. And that's so you want to make sure you have forms with you. We tell you too that when you're traveling somewhere to have those forms with you in the vehicle. And like I said, we think you ought to have 2 vehicles, so you ought to have forms in both vehicles. And even higher level security is to make copies so you leave one set of forms back at the church. Okay? All right? Liability release forms is the other thing that you want to have, and that's different than a medical form. Liability release forms are usually created by the company you're going. So like when we went to that whitewater rafting place, there was a liability release form that we had to have filled out for each person, both adult and youth, and those children had to have their parents sign it. Okay? So, and I've heard of youth ministers, especially, going on trips like that and showing up and realizing that they had to have liability forms for their kids and not have them. Because the wise ones say, sorry guys, we have to go home. The ones that think they can get away with it forge signatures, and I've seen that go bad before. Okay? So any of those places, Mountaintop, rock climbing, New Frontiers, any of the Ocoee places, Duck River, any of those places, they're going to have those liability forms on their site. So just once you know you're going there, just download it and make it a part of the process for them being able to go on the trip. Okay? Then the third spot is spaces. And we want to hold things in highly visible locations. So that means that, like here, as I was giving Trevor a hard time as we were looking for rooms for your coaching groups, these doors on this main floor, which is the children's level, they have barn door style doors, or the dairy, what are they called, where they're half doors? Dutch doors. So their doors are Dutch doors. So they then, in order for those doors to be appropriate for Safe Sanctuaries, then the top half of that door should always be open when there are children and adults in those spaces, and so on. Okay? All right? Upstairs, there are windows in the doors. Okay? And those door windows, if you're thinking about doing some renovation on your church, make sure those door windows are not at 6 foot high level and just a small square. Okay? Because I saw the church do that in a construction project, and they were not very happy with us when we said, those windows aren't really going to work. Because you want to have those windows that are, they're 3 or 4, maybe 5 inches wide, that's reinforced and probably about 3 feet tall, 2 to 3 feet tall, the narrow ones, so that you can see in. What's even better is to have a full wide window, but it needs to also be a reinforced window. Okay? When at all times you don't need to, you can leave doors open. Just leave the doors open. If you don't have, say for some reason, I'm going to pick on Chandra because she knows I do. But Chandra was supposed to be Trisha's second person this morning for 3rd grade Sunday school. Okay? Because it was all girls, first of all. And Ben and Christine have their Sunday school class in this space too. But it's with 5th graders and so on. But here's the problem. Chandra bails at the last minute. She decides that it's much more important to get her nails done than it is to come teach 3rd grade Sunday school. So she calls Trish and says, Trish, I'm getting real sick. not going to be there. I know it's like 5 minutes to 1. I'm supposed to be there. But so here's what Trish needs to do. She's probably not going to be able to get a volunteer. But if she is, then she gets an award. But if she doesn't, she's going to come and she's going to say, all right, third graders, we're going to come on in and we're going to sit in this fellowship hall. While Ben and Christine have their class over there, we're going to sit over here and have our class. Okay? So you're going to bring classes together. You're going to share space so that you can hit the adult needed ratio. You're going to come over as you're coming in. You're going to let them know, hey, we're here because Chandra bailed on me, or Chandra was sick, and so we want to pray for Chandra until you see her on Monday with nice shiny French press nails or whatever. But anyway, combine classes when those kind of things happen. Don't freak out, just combine classes. And then talk to your class about being together. The thing that we don't often do is explain why we had to move from our space. And so we're not going to say boys and girls, we had to move because Miss Chandra flaked out on us. We're going to say, we want to make sure that you're safe and that I'm safe. And so we're going to go share this room where Ben and Pastor Ben and Pastor Christine are having class. Okay? But we have to be quiet and we have to focus on our lesson while they're focusing on their lesson. Okay? We need to make sure that we explain to children and youth why we do some of those things that we do. We also need to explain that if we do show up someplace and we don't have the proper forms, or we show up to the church and adults bail on us and we don't have enough supervision and we can't recruit those other parents to come in, that we have to figure out what's our alternative plan and explain that as well. Okay? So what are we going to do differently in that situation? We talked about this before with doors locked. Keep remote and unused areas locked. And so, like I'll give Smyrna first. Maybe they just did it because they knew we were going to be here and we're teaching about it. Maybe they do it all the time. I don't know. But their doors were locked this morning, and Trevor had to unlock them for us to use it. So they get bonus points. Now, I don't know if it's like that all the time. Is it? Okay. All right. Well, Trevor gets bonus points because the trustees get bonus points. But don't, if you don't have locks on your doors, figure out how to get locks on your doors. Okay? And I'm not talking about, don't put those little hook and eyelet locks on there, especially on the inside, because my son would lock himself in a room when he was that age, and then put bread through the back of a fan to make snow. It happened. He didn't lock the door. World Communion Sunday, do not, listen, don't give bread to 4-year-olds on World Communion Sunday and say, just take as much as you want. Because they're going to find a fan, and they're going to tear off pieces of it, and they're going to put it through the back of it, so then when it blows out the front side, it looks like a snowstorm. And if that happens in a brand new church building, like it did where I was a youth minister, do you think that I slept very well the rest of that week until the choir director came back in and made sure that I tried to pass it off that Chip did it, but my kids were there too. Right? And the other thing is, that really happened. The other thing is, establish action plans. Establish action plans. So like we talked about, what do we do in the case of an active shooter? What do we do in the case of bad weather? What do we do in the case of a fire? Okay? What do we do in the case of a flood? I was in a high school, running a high school wrestling tournament in Brentwood one day, one weekend, and this kid who went to Brentwood got mad because he got pinned, and when he ran off the mat and ran out in the hallway, he threw his headgear, and he hit the tip off of a sprinkler head. Okay? And when you break off the tip of one of those, it drains the entire system that are connected to that deal. So we had this massive flood that flooded into the gym, onto the mats, and into that hallway. We had to shut that thing down. We had to basically shut the tournament down, let people leave so that the fire department could come in and repressurize the system. We had to have an action plan because some kid lost his temper about losing the match. So you got to be prepared for action that might happen. Okay? And then what about that space known as cyberspace? Okay? Cyberspace. Because we know that at least, and probably more than that now, because this was just a few days ago, that 73% of teens, 13 to 17-year-olds, have smartphones. And I would even say, if we go a little bit lower, that there are 10-year-olds, 9-year-olds that have smartphones, and I don't know the exact percentage of that. So the reality is on that, one, a lot of them, because their parents don't want to pay the bill, have unlimited data. So even if you have a closed network, they have unlimited data, so they're still going to be able to access the internet and access the apps or different things that they have. So you, in youth ministry, children's ministry, tween ministry, need to have conversations about how do we use the internet appropriately. Okay? That can be a lesson as part of our Christian discipleship. Okay? We need to talk to parents about it as well. There are many parents that have no clue what kind of access they've given their kids once they've given them a smartphone. Okay? We have to have conversations with them about it. Have classes about it. If you need somebody to give a class on cyber safety, let us know. Okay? Another resource is your police station, because they're dealing with it all the time. Okay? They're dealing with it all the time. One of my friends wrote in a blog, he said, it's one thing to give them their space, and it's another to give them all of the space. It's not about control, and it's not even all about protection. Parents don't necessarily need to kick their children off social media, but they do need to be able to walk with them. And my poor daughter is the example that I always use, and so because I was with my friends and more informed folks, they told me about an app that kids have now, and I'd seen it on Facebook, like a posting from it, but I didn't know what it was. And Chandra is an expert in it, and she told me about this app called Sarah Off. You know about it? Raise your hand. Sarah Off, you know about it, okay? So it's this anonymous messaging app, basically. And so they can, one person will say, well, it's just used for fun, it's nothing bad. Another person will say, well, yeah, I use it to bully people. Another person might say, well, that's how I send explicit messages to somebody that I like. Okay? Because it's anonymous. All right? What's that? Yik Yak was that way too, right? Okay? So know what they're using and help their parents know what they're using. And so, because every parent, until they realize that their child is probably on there, are going to think they don't do any of that stuff. Back when Facebook first came around, I had a young man in my youth group, and I talked to them all about Facebook, and the mom said afterwards, she said, thank you for telling him about that, but you don't have to worry about him, he doesn't have one. I said, oh, okay, that's fine. And so the next day, as I was looking on Facebook, his name popped up to friend me as a request to friend me. And I was like, hey, I didn't think you had a request. I didn't think you had Facebook. He said, oh, don't tell my mom, I did that over at my friend's house. Okay? And so we had a conversation with his mom. Okay? Because I would want her to have that conversation with my child, and then with me as well. Just like one of our friends did with our child about Snapchat when it first came out. You know, one of our friends called and said, hey, I didn't think you let them have Snapchat. I was like, well, none of them do. And she did. But she put it on the very last page. As you scrolled over on the app storage pages on your phone, it was on the far one that Shelley would never go to. And so we had to talk about that, right? Keisha, right?
You said, can you tell me the name of that? Sarah?
So Sarah with an H and then A-H.
Fake news.
Yeah, Sarah, S-A-R-A-H-A-H.
Brad,
Yeah.
there's also after school.
After school?
Yeah, you have to have a school ID number, but most of the kids do to sign up, and then it can be totally anonymous, so parents can't even really get in there and see.
Yeah.
We don't have a school ID.
Yeah, so after school is another one.
And it's used a lot to bully or to send explicit messages.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've done in the past year is contract with a cyber safety specialist, and we have a cyber safety set of guidelines and policy. I know it's hard to see, but it's in your Google Drive folder, and it's social media guidelines for churches and internet and security and safety guide. So we contracted with a social media expert, and he created these guidelines, and so they're there for you to use, download, share with your church. They're on that same tnumc.org Safe Spaces page, and so on. But they're also in that Google Drive folder. Okay? All right, now, we're going to do a speed course in boundaries so that we can stay on time. But I want you to think about the fact that all that we've talked about so far has been about guidelines, but it's also been about relationships. Okay? So we can have these guidelines, but if we think they're more about, we don't have to apply them to everyone, then we're going to set ourselves up for a lot of risk. Okay? And so personal boundaries are important. And like I said before, we have to balance safe sanctuaries and boundaries to be able to have a more holistic connection, to be able to help people experience the love of God. And so just so we know that personal boundaries are guidelines and rules that limit a person, that limits a person creates to identify reasonable and safe permissible ways that other people can behave towards them and how they will respond when someone passes those limits. So when my daughter was in preschool, she was about 3 or 4, I think, and they did a little lesson on boundaries and personal space and so on. And Collins, Mary is 4, Collins is 2 at that time. Collins was the great annoyer. Now Mary is the great annoyer, now that they're 16 and 14. But then it was Collins, so she's just paying him back. And so Mary came home one day, we were talking, and she was telling me all about boundaries. And she said, everybody has a personal space. Everybody has a personal bubble. And so Collins comes running over there, and like Mary's telling me about this big personal bubble that she's got, and Collins comes over and just runs right into her. And she was like, Collins, stop it! I have a personal bubble, and you're bursting it right now. Okay? But we know that, right? I mean, a 4-year-old knew it. But like, we have those people who just don't understand personal space or personal boundaries, and they want to get right up in your business, or they're the ones that are going to come up when you go to greet them, and you want to try to avoid them because you know they're going to slam their hand on your back, and so it's so good to see you. Okay? But we're not talking about that. We're talking about how do we interact, and what do we do in terms of how we create opportunities for engagement that create real relationship and real connection in ministry. And so one of the best things that I've seen explained is a video that I want to share with you. And the lens is youth ministry because Andrew Root, who's going to be talking about it, is being interviewed by Yale Seminary in terms of, with their youth ministry focus. But watch this video.
Andy, in your book, Revisiting Relational Youth Ministry, you kind of created this door where you're asking youth leaders to be more vulnerable with their students. Is there a boundary, a barrier? What's too far in that kind of model that you've put forth?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's an irony that plays within all of this that I think is very significant and we rarely talk about within youth ministry itself, which is that when the relationship is for something, when the relationship actually is the tool that you're using to meet some other end, that it becomes very hard to hold a boundary. Because after all, you know, if you want to close this deal, you need to always be available. You need to be able to, you know, meet your customer's demand. But the irony is when it's human person to human person, when it's encountering each other's humanity, when it's really about sharing in each other's person and recognizing God moving in and through that, then boundaries become incredibly significant with the relationship itself. And that boundaries have to exist to keep the relationship human person to human person. And so I am actually pushing us to articulate and wrestle with young people, wrestle with the faith story, wrestle with our own faith story before young people, to wrestle with our own questions of doubt and fear with young people. But we have to do that by respecting the boundaries and the barriers between us. And I think one of the things we really have to help youth workers, and we have to think of ourselves, is that actually boundaries are essential to relationship. In that I would be very skeptical of a youth worker who had no boundaries. Like a youth worker who said, yeah, I work 70 hours a week, or I haven't had a vacation in forever, or I like, you know, if a kid calls me anytime, I'll go pick them up. I mean, there's reasons to think that way, to say, well, if a kid's ever in trouble, I will go out and do that. But there's a fine line between holding a boundary, and I think boundaries are essential to relationships. And there's an irony, a deep irony within this, that if we hold boundaries with young people, that we actually give them a gift, which is we give them a gift of someone who is in their lives not to meet their needs, or someone who's getting paid to meet their needs. That you actually, when you put up a boundary and say, hey guys, thanks for coming by my house, but I'm putting my daughter to sleep right now, or thanks, but I'm on vacation, that what you actually communicate to young people is that this is a relationship of human person to human person, and that you are a human being who has others that you're connected to, that who has others that you're responsible to, that communication of a boundary actually is a gift to them. It's an invitation to share in your person, not just consume you when they're bored, or you're not just there to meet their needs. And so one of the places that I would start with kind of thinking about formation in ministry with youth workers is to think about how they're both open and closed with young people. In what ways are you open to young people, and what way are you closed with young people? In true vulnerability with someone, true vulnerability with our spouse, to our friends, true vulnerability honors the open and closeness. It's not really vulnerability if you just puke all of your experiences all over somebody. I mean, that actually is kind of corrosive to relationship itself. That true relationship honors the open and closedness, and vulnerability comes within that, where I don't confuse, you don't exist simply to take on all of my issues. Like, you're not there as my trash can to dump all this stuff. And so I think it does take some reflection on how do we share these fears and doubts with young people. How do we actually do that, and do that in a way that respects the power dynamic between an adult and a kid, but also really respects their humanity? And we've probably all had experiences where people just, you said, hey, how you doing? And I said, terrible, blah, 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 and they just kind of puke this stuff on you. You're like, well, thank you very much. Like, that becomes fundamentally inappropriate and actually pushes away from relationship. So there is this kind of sensitivity to this open and closed dynamic, and there's some things that young people probably should just never know. Like, they don't need to know all about the conflict you're having with your spouse or something like that. That maybe actually is a way to hurt the relationship by pulling them into that. So I think that becomes a significant piece, to think about vulnerability and to think about it within this open and closed dynamic. To keep boundaries and barriers actually is grace. And I think it's one of the ways to even understand the biblical narrative in the Genesis text, that the reason the tree is at the center of the garden, and this is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, is because it's a barrier that is a gift to the human creatures, that God is God and they are human beings. That it allows them to be in relationship with God in and through that barrier. And once the barrier is violated, once they go in and eat of the tree, God's grieving isn't because they stole fruit and God was hoarding it for himself. It's because they crossed the boundary, that they crossed the boundary and violated the relationship between them and God. And now they shall surely die.
All right, so let's regroup. Let's regroup. I want to hear. I don't think I've heard from Monica in the Carthage group. What's some things that maybe you guys heard?
Just that you got to be open, but you don't want to overshare. You don't want to tell everything, that all your problems you're dealing with and your struggles, because their emotional maturity is pretty good.
So you got to understand what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. Like, I had to deal with a youth minister one time who always talked about his smoking hot wife and how much fun they were going to have in the evening. That's a true story. When I talked to him, he was not happy that I called him about it. And it wasn't Sean, so don't look at Sean. No, but seriously, I had to deal with that, and I had to deal with his anger, and I said to him, I'm just trying to help you, to keep you from being in trouble, to help you understand what's appropriate. Seriously, yes.
I was just going to say, and that's not always like bad behavior for sharing. We had some youth leaders once that were vegan, and I have no problem with vegan. With being vegan.
Vegan, yeah.
But this community was a high hunting community, and they wouldn't allow the kids to talk about hunting. They really didn't want them getting meat when they were out eating together. And You know, so you cannot force your choices on your youth as well.
Yeah, you can't force your those kind of choices on them, you know? It made me remind me, Monica, of my last youth ministry trip with my youth group network before I went to the conference office. We went to do hurricane recovery in Mississippi, and what they didn't tell us was that we were staying at a Seventh-day Adventist retreat center. So my hardy meat eaters were not happy when they found out that Seventh-day Adventists were vegan, and we had to be vegans all week. And so it wasn't my fault, all right? I didn't know or realize that that's where we were staying. And I don't think I fully understood at the time that Seventh-day Adventists were even vegan. But now I do. So if you're thinking about a retreat center and your kids are meat eaters, don't go to Seventh-day Adventists. But if you have all vegans, more power to you. All right, what else did you hear? Right over here, Dee.
Well, one of the things that really hit us when we talked about was the puking on people.
Yeah.
Because it really is, because it corrodes everything. It really, really does. And there are those times when we've done that to others, you know. But an isolated instance is different than a consistent, continual, you know. And in those situations, you have to go, okay, time out. You know, this is where it stops. You know, otherwise, it's just going to burn you up.
Right. What's appropriate to share, what's not? When is it puking? When is it unnecessary? You know, we see this happen sometimes in situations of care when somebody's hurt or in the hospital or somebody's just died, and we try to think it's helping them by saying, oh, but this happened, my dog died last week, I'm sorry about your husband. You know, and it's like, no, that's not appropriate there. Okay? There's a circle of care that I saw one time that says that when you're dealing with care, that the person who is being cared for is in the center, and everything else that should come to them should flow outward from the center, not inward upon them, okay? So if somebody has, like I ran my hand through a table saw back when my son was little, and all my mother-in-law called me and she said, oh, I know how you feel, I've had a hangnail on my big toe for a week. And I was like, no you don't, not until you've ran it through a table saw, you don't know what that feels like. So that was not really right? And so, but we do that, but we don't understand sometimes when we're trying to help that what we're doing is actually piling on. Yeah, Bob?
When I was young and didn't know anything, as opposed to being old and not knowing anything, I was a 1 year out youth director and music director, and I gave one of my youth choir members a ride because she needed a ride. Didn't think anything about it because nothing's going on. And I was blessed to have a minister to come and talk to me about the appropriateness of that and inappropriateness of that, but not just in a scolding way, but to explain why. And what he said was, you're sending, amongst other things, was he said you're sending the wrong message to this child. That because you're not setting boundaries, you're sending a message that there are no boundaries. And so if something else were to come up, then the appropriateness or inappropriate lines get blurred.
That's right.
Just because you did something innocent but inappropriate.
Right.
So it doesn't always have to be really damaging.
Right.
To send the wrong message.
Right. John?
Yeah, I may get some freedom from this one myself because it's bothered me ever since I said it. One of the youth in the church, she was doing a dance, and it was beautiful, and she's beautiful. And I said, Holly Berry ain't got nothing on you. And the way I meant it was just really innocent, but after I said it, I thought about it, she just smiled, she didn't respond to it no kind of way, really. But it still bothered me. Maybe I should have said that, you know. And I didn't mean anything bad, but I said, Holly Berry ain't got nothing on you. I said, you did a great job, and I just, but it bothered me, and I'm getting some freedom, so. This person doesn't say anything like that.
In the name of Jesus Christ, you are forgiven. Say it back to me. So, now, earlier I showed you some pictures of some mug shots. Oops, go back. I want you to look at these again, and I want to fill you in on a story that I know of one of them. Because it was a story where boundaries were not set clear, and yeses were said to things that no's should have been said to. And one yes led to that should have been a no became a yes, and another yes that should have been a no said because I said that first yes, and so on. And it's a story that you'll be able to read the article. It's in your Google Drive, but it's about a young female. She's there, her mugshot's there in the middle, and she was the spouse of a youth minister. I think she still is, but she was the spouse of a youth minister who was serving in the youth ministry. They had a great youth ministry there at the church that they serve in Franklin, and she was leading a small group of guys, and she and her husband. And the story is there in the paper. They were having some strain in their marriage, and this young man started to show interest, and she took him home one day, and they started talking to each other. She said yes to spending more time with him than she was the rest of the group or with the other adult that's part of that small group, and eventually they started having a relationship. Okay? And she realized that she had crossed too many lines, and she confessed this to her husband. And of course, her husband, he loved her and loves her, but he knew when he had to report it. And so he reported it to his senior pastor, and of course, the senior pastor and so on, they reported it to the police because it's a mandatory thing that you have to report, right? And so she was arrested, very public, and so on. The church supported the youth minister. They wanted to support her and help her get counseling, help her have recovery, and so on. And so that's a situation where you have to understand that sometimes when we think we're helping, we might be setting ourselves up for a yes we don't mean to say. And it's not a yes that we meant to cause either. It happened through just a mistake of situation where we thought we needed to do something more than we should have done in that situation. We thought maybe we could fix a family problem, or we thought we could be there more than we needed to be, right? And at the expense of something else. And this young lady, who I don't believe was a predator, but yet now she's classified as a predator, that was her intention, but that's where she is now. Okay? And they're trying to put their life back together. That church handled it the way they were supposed to. There's another church that you'll be able to read the article about that didn't handle it appropriately. Again, it happened in children's ministry, and it happened with a young man who was volunteering with his mom, who was leading a nursery, and mom sent her son to the bathroom with a little boy, and while they were in the bathroom, the young man sexually assaulted or sexually abused that child. A week later, when it was time to go back to church, mom and dad were talking to the little boy and said, "Hey, let's get ready to go to church." And then the little boy starts crying, starts throwing a fit, says he never wants to go back again. They said this was a kid who loved being there, and so on. Parents continued to talk to him more, and he started to share about what happened in the bathroom. Parents of the abused boy, reported it to the church. Thought that the church would do something about it. The church never did anything about it. They wanted to just deal with it in a Christian way, through internally, and not deal with it. Okay. Parents finally went to the police. Parents sued the church, big lawsuit, and so on. Okay. Just this last week, if you saw in the news, Brentwood Academy, another situation that came out. Okay. You cannot hide or try to cover up instances of abuse. It's not worth it. It causes more harm for the victim, and I believe for the offender, than if you dealt with it in the first place. Okay? And it's definitely going to cause more harm to your congregation or your organization or whatever it is. Monica, you had your hand up.
Just a reminder, this is a good time. We're all mandatory reporters.
Yes, we are.
And so you don't really get to handle that in a Christian way under
Right.
the coverage.
You have to. We're all mandatory reporters.
That's required.
Yeah. And so, So all this to say is, we say yes to some things we definitely have to say no to. But just because we said yes to something at one point doesn't mean we have to compound it by another yes, okay? Let's try to cover that yes up. And that's what we see happening too much, okay? Matt, you had your hand up, and then we're going to...
Just talking about the mandatory reporting. If in youth ministry or in children's ministry or any part of the church, if you become aware or witness something and you do go through the channels to the hierarchy of the church, and the church doesn't do what they're supposed to do in this case, what should be done?
Then you report it.
You have to report it.
Yeah, you report it. Yeah. And I've been through the reporting process in situations where I thought definitely there should have been something more done. And I filed a report and went through a long phone call and with Department of Children's Services and so on. And they said, we'll let you know, and so on. And they got back to me later and said, because it was over the internet and this was happening and across this situation and so on, and we didn't see any real harm, we're not going to investigate. Okay? But I still reported it because now that report is there so that if somebody else comes back and reports a similar situation involving this person, there's a file there that continues to build. Yeah. Right. And so what to think about it is that all of us have power. We don't have as much power as we often think we do, and we have a lot more power than we often think we do. Okay? And the concept of power has nothing to do with how strong we are or anything else, but it's by the amount of resources that we have and the positions that we hold. Okay? And he talked about it in that video, that you have to respect the power dynamic, is what he said, right? And so power means that if you have greater resources, so greater knowledge, greater influence, greater opportunity, older, whatever, you have power in that space. And so you have the potential to help or hurt a situation or a person. Vulnerability means that you have less resources, fewer resources. And so you have the potential for being helped or hurt. And so each of us have the ability to be in either one of these two spots at any different time. We have to recognize that about ourselves. That we have power and sometimes we're vulnerable. Okay? And how we live in relationship and how we understand boundaries helps us be better secure and safe in that space. Okay? So how we interact with people is important. What we say yes and no to is important. And the reality is that sometimes we see a situation that we think that we're the one that has to help, but our helping can possibly hurt. And I'm not talking about hurting the situation or the person that you're trying to help, but it could hurt yourself. And so I've been married. I've talked about my wife a lot. We've been married for 27 years, and we've been together for almost 30. And she's been a pediatrician for most of that time, and so having call at night and everything else. So I hear a lot in the middle of the night how she handles situations and so on, and I've learned so much from her that that not everything is an emergency, but some things are. And those things that are emergencies, you're not necessarily the one that can solve that emergency, but you may be the one that can connect them to the people who can, or the situation, or the resources that can fix it, right? And so our job is not to fix the situation. Our job is not to try to fix it, because when we think that we're the only ones that can fix the situation for somebody, we're setting ourselves up to cross a boundary. And that boundary may be that we're crossing a boundary that would possibly cause harm to that situation, or we're crossing a boundary that might cause harm to ourselves. It might cause harm to our family. It might cause harm to plans that we've set up that we feel like that we just have to break and constantly put these other things in front of our family or opportunities, right? So there's always something there. So we have to be aware that our job is not to fix. Our job is to help them be more deeply connected to their Creator. So that means in those situations where there's pain and suffering or whatever, if we are in that situation in counseling. Like I had to be with a family a week or so ago that their son was killed in a car accident. I couldn't fix that situation, and I loved their son as much as they did, as they said with me. But in our shared grief together, I just had to be present with him. And I had to be present with the rest of his friends and the rest of our folks that loved him too. But I couldn't fix that situation, right? I had to remind them of who he was and remind myself of who he was. And I had to remind them of who God is and how God is still with us in that place. So I had to connect them and all of us more deeply to God who created us so that we could get through that pain in that situation. And so I don't know the stories of the people that you're working with in your ministry, but we're not going to be able to fix their stories. But we are going to be able to point them to God who can help them fix their stories. And as we finish up these slides, I want to make sure you understand this. In ministry, we often think it's a sprint. And so we run fast and we run hard and we think we have to be the one to run the race. But it's going to need to be more like a marathon, and it's actually going to need to be more like a relay marathon, if that's for real. Because we're going to have to do our part, and we're going to have to hand it off to somebody else, and so on. But we're not God, and so we're going to have to take time to take days off. And so, like, I'll be off on Monday. Don't call me. Don't email me. Okay? So how can we care for others if we don't care for ourselves first? Self-care is one of the biggest crushes and harm. Not taking care of yourself is one of the biggest challenges to people in ministry. Okay? We have to take time to care for ourselves. Then boundaries become more easily crossed when we think that we have to be the one to sacrifice our own boundaries for somebody else, or our own self, or our own time, or our own Sabbath for somebody else. And then there's a good reason why we have to put our oxygen masks up first. We have to have the oxygen. We have to have the energy. We have to have the space to be able to be rejuvenated in order to be able to be connected and involved in another space. Here's as we close. This is important, and here what I'm going to do for you guys is I don't have to be the one to come and train your church in Safe Sanctuaries. What Julie or Chandra or Mandy or Christy or Christine can do that, or we can train you to train your church. Okay? Because the training that you've been going through now is much deeper than what I would ask you to train your church. I want you to be aware of this so that you're able to recognize it and able to have those conversations. But we've created a training that is focused in on the needs of safe sanctuaries and the combination of boundaries, not the whole video and all that, but a training that you can do in an hour and 15 minutes with your church. Okay? And we'll make that available to you with the script and everything else. Okay? But one thing that I want to make sure that you always do, that I don't always do, is I want to make sure that you're hearing the definitions of these abuse situations, because we don't always think about it, and I think it's important that we read it and we share it. So physical abuse is non-accidental physical trauma or injury inflicted by a parent or a caretaker on a child. It also includes a parent or a caretaker's failure to protect the child from another person who perpetuated physical abuse on a child. In its most severe form, it is likely to cause great bodily harm or death. Neglect, failure to provide for a child's physical survival needs to the extent that there is harm or risk of harm to the child's health or safety. This may include, but is not limited to, abandonment, lack of supervision, lack of adequate nutrition that places the child below normal growth curves, lack of shelter, lack of medical care or dental that results in health-threatening conditions, and the inability to meet basic clothing needs of a child. Most severe form, physical neglect may also result in great bodily harm or death. Sexual abuse. Penetration includes penetration, external touching of a child's intimate parts, oral sex with a child, indecent exposure, or any other sexual act performed in a child's presence for sexual gratification. Sexual use of a child for prostitution, and the manufacturing of child pornography. Child sexual abuse is also the willful failure of the parent or the child's caretaker to make a reasonable effort to stop this from happening by another person. Psychological harm is a repeated pattern of caregiver behavior or extreme incidents that convey to the child that they are worthless, flawed, unloved, unwanted, endangered, or only of value in meeting another person's needs, and may include both abusive acts against the child or the failure to act, or neglectful behavior when age-appropriate action is required for a child's health development. It can occur as part of a one-time incident, but it's usually chronic. It's important that we hear and understand these definitions. Okay? It's important that we hear them and understand them. And then, as we talked about before, it's important to understand that we are a mandatory reporter state. And sadly, not every state is, but we are. Okay? And so you have the ability to report. And so what do you do if you're not sure that something is occurring, but you're seeing these signs? What do you do? Trust your team. Have conversations. Not in front of everyone, but pull them together and say, hey, I'm seeing this. Are you seeing this? How can we, what do you know about what's going on here? Pull things together. You're not investigating, but you're together as a team to talk about the situation. Okay? Most likely, they're seeing it too. Okay? You're seeing a different behavior from a child or a youth that has normally been like that little boy that the parents realized something was going on different. And you're seeing this child act strange now in your experience. You know, take notice of that. Okay? I had to one time, I was a football coach at middle school, and we'd ended practice, and this dad was there. They watched practice every time we had practice. This whole town did. And this was for 7th and 8th graders, so it was pretty strange. But this dude thought his son was going to be a professional football player, and the kid was pretty good, but he didn't become one. He didn't even go to college, but maybe because of the way the dad hit him so many times in the head, trying to teach him how to block and then how to tackle. And so as I saw this going on, as I was walking to the locker room, and I heard the dad saying, hit me again, hit me again. I turned around, and the guy was forearm shivering him in the head, you know, and so I grabbed my assistant coach, and we went over, and we had to separate this dad from his son. And this conversation was around the fact that you know, dude, he just came out of practice. What are you doing? He was like, well, I'm trying to teach him how to be tough. It's like, well, it looks like abuse to me, you know. And so I didn't know these rules at that time. I was in Indiana at the time, and so I talked to my friend, and I talked to this principal and so on, and we decided to just let it go, but to keep our eye out for it. Okay? And so we've all seen those kind of things. Okay? But for me to have stood by there and watched that dad continually harm him, and just while he was trying to teach him how to be tough, that would have been wrong of me as well. And so I say that to think that, to help you know this, that the job of keeping ourselves alert is everybody's responsibility. It's not just me as the guy that's in charge of training and policy creation and so on. It's not just you as the people that are serving in ministry, but it's everybody in the congregation. It's even the youth and children that are in the classroom or in the ministry that are responsible. And I want you to stand up, and I want you to form a circle around the room so that you can be responsible. Is important. We all have to keep our eyes open. We all have to be a part of being aware of what's going on, because in our connectedness and in our committedness, there's great power that comes from that. But if Sean decides that he's not going to participate anymore and lets go of John or Julie's hand, the energy stops. And so he joins back in, but then Camille decides, I'm tired of talking to my husband, is it your husband? I'm tired. I'm mad at him. He didn't make his bed, make the bed or something, so we're done. Okay? So we tend to think that, oh, but hey, it's only Dee's job, so we're going to let Dee's hand go because it's really only Dee's job to make sure everybody's safe. Okay? And the energy stops. Okay? So it only works if we're all connected and if we're all committed to doing what we need to do. Okay? So does anyone have an idea of what I used to teach?